Welcome, everyone. This is the Book of Deuteronomy, Telling and Retelling, Part 2. This is the third session of our nine-part series with Rabbi David Silber. This is a continuation of Part 1 from the Fallsmont. And if you want to catch up, you are more than welcome to do so on our YouTube channel or audio library. In this class, we will continue looking at Deuteronomy with Rabbi Silber. Sources will be shared on screen, but if you have your own Tanakh, you're always welcome to follow along with that. And with that, I'd like to hand over the mic to Rabbi Silber.
All right, so we're in the middle of the speeches of Moshe to the people, I would say in part 2 of Sefer Dvarim. He's talking about the performance of the mitzvot. After the 10 commandments, we have the Shema. We've talked about that. And what we have over here, for the most part, till chapter 12 through chapter 11, are some speeches by Moshe in which he fundamentally warns the people about potential pitfalls in the future. And in particular, we won't deal with this week. Hopefully next week, he spends a fair amount of time. He picks out one particular event that happened early in the Torah, which he did not mention in the beginning of the book when he has a so-called history. He left that out. But here he devotes a lot of, in this section, a lot of space to this particular event. One might say the central story for Moshe in the past, which is the story of the golden calf, which he retells in a very interesting way. We won't deal with that this week, but hopefully we'll get to that, hopefully next week. I'm hoping to look at that. It's very, very important. Meanwhile, we're after the Shema in chapter 6. Let's begin with verse number 16. We're not going to deal with everything. All of these things can be spoken about in great ways, but to get some general picture. So verse number 16, Lo tenasu et Hashem Elohechem, kasher nisitem b'masa, shamar tishmur et mitzvot Hashem Elohechem, edosa v'chukav asher tzivach. So we discussed this last time. This is a story, of course, Moshe recalls the story of Masa and Riva. This we discussed last week. And there's a general warning over here not to test or to try God. And the fundamental idea is that the testing or the trying of God, as Moshe describes it in these chapters, comes down to not having faith in God, not believing that God will be faithful to God's word. So is God really, God made promises, God's going to keep the promises. And if one is testing God, in effect, one is suggesting that we can't rely upon God's promises. One of the terms that's used for God in these chapters are El HaNe'eman, the faithful God. Faithful means God keeps God's word. So this is the prohibition. I'm not going over this again. Of Lo tenasu et Hashem Elohechem, kasher nisitem b'masa. That's actually a very interesting and broad topic, but it's not for now. We touched upon it last week. Now the next verse, beginning in verse number 18. So we have verses 18 and 19. Verse 18 is V'asita hayashar v'yatov b'yenei Hashem, l'man yitavlach, uvata v'yorashta et haaretz hatova asher nishba Hashem la'avotecha. So you should do hayashar v'hatov. In my translation is, you should do what is right and good. Yashar v'tov, in order that God will be good to you, and you will inherit the good land which God swore to give to your ancestors. So when you read this particular verse, you notice immediately, of course, that the word tov appears in 3 different forms in this one verse. You should do what is yashar and tov, in order that yitavlach, God be good to you, and you inhabit haaretz hatova, the good land. So it sounds like a sort of a consequence. If you do good things, God will be good to you in return, and you inherit the good land. Of course, the implication is, and it's clear from other parts of this book, that if you don't do good things, there'll be a very different consequence. On this verse, V'yasita hayashar v'hatov, I wanted to mention there's a very, very important Ramban, very critical Ramban. And the Ramban says the following. Rashi, in fact, on this verse, do what is Yashar and Tov. Says Rashi, Yashar and Tov, says Rashi, it's a pshara v'lifnim mishurat adin. Pshara means a compromise. The Talmud already discusses when you come to court, there's a case. So someone says I owe them $200, and I say I don't owe them anything. One of us is telling the truth, presumably, but perhaps we can't figure out who it is. I have one version of the story. The other fellow has a different version of the story. So the Gemara discusses, what should the court try to do? Should the court try to figure out who really is right and who is wrong? Either say, I don't have to pay or I do have to pay, or should the court try to make a compromise? It is, okay, pay the guy $100 or something along those lines. And there are three different opinions in the beginning of Masechet Sanhedrin about what is the optimal thing the court should do. There's one position, the court should always try to make a compromise, make peace. There's another position, the court's permitted to make a compromise, not necessarily should do that. And there's the third opinion, the court is forbidden to make a compromise. And of course, the issue, which is a very important issue, is on one hand, the truth is most likely that either I owe the money or I don't. On the other hand, each one of us has a certain claim. Maybe there's a misunderstanding. So then the court, in order to make peace, the court will set out on the path of compromise. It's the conflict between the truth and shalom and emet. This is the question. So Rashi here says, Yasita hayashar v'atov. Rashi on this verse cites the position that yashar and tov, the good thing to do is to make compromises. And the other thing Rashi says is, lifnim mishurat adin, to go beyond the law. To do good means I'm required to do X. I'm required to give some charity. Okay, there's a minimum amount I should give. But if you want to go beyond, you go beyond. You do more. You do better. And in all spheres of life, that's called lifnim mishurat adin. Someone says, I had a worker. They didn't do a good job. I really shouldn't have to pay them anything. But Asita hayashar v'atov perhaps says, I should pay them. That's the idea of lifnim mishurat adin. What's bothering Rashi here is, what do you mean do what's good and right? We have the mitzvot. So what do you mean? What do you mean do what's good? Just say Moshe says over and over again, observe the mitzvot. We have the 10 commandments. Lo tachmod, lo tignov. I mean, what do we need these generalizations for? That's what's bothering Rashi. So Rashi says, okay, but sometimes you go beyond this compromise. Compromise is not really the strict law, because the one person is right and one person is wrong. But nonetheless, sometimes the best path is the path of compromise. Sometimes you should try to go beyond the law. You don't have to do it, but go beyond. That's Rashi. On this verse, there's a very important Ramban. And this Ramban ties in with other Rambans, two other Rambans in his commentary on the Torah. Ramban on the Torah is one of the great works in that tradition. There's no question about that. And the Ramban, against Rashi, takes the following position. We should all be familiar with this. In Sefer Shemot, so the book is about, of course, we're reading the book of Exodus now, leaving the land of Egypt, becoming free people. For what purpose? What is the purpose? Rashi claims the purpose is to receive the Torah. To receive the Torah, it's a blueprint for life. Yes, then you go into the land and you live the Torah in the land, perform the mitzvot, but fundamentally for Rashi, the goal of the Exodus was receiving the Torah. Now, receiving the Torah in the book of Exodus, we all remember, chapter 19 of the preparations, chapter 20 of the 10 commandments, chapter 24 is the book of the covenant. People say Naaseh v'nishma, that's chapter 24. Chapter 25 begins the story of building of the Mishkan, building the tabernacle. And then you have the golden calf, and then the building of the tabernacle. And Rashi makes the claim in his commentary that really, the whole tabernacle, the whole Mishkan, was a result of sin. People want something material, something they can see and touch and feel. They'll make a golden calf. And Rashi says, because of that, God says, okay, you want a golden calf? You can have a kosher golden calf. We'll call it the Mishkan. We'll call it the temple. But for Rashi, at least Rashi's commentary in the book of Shemot, That was a b'di'evet. That was the result of sin. But in a perfect world, that would never have happened. You don't need a Mishkan. You have the Torah. It's good enough. Rashi, but the book doesn't end with the receiving of the Torah. That's chapter 24. The book has 40 chapters. So the Ramban strongly disagrees with Rashi there and elsewhere. And the Ramban says the Torah is in order. It's not out of order. There are rare situations where you can read things out of order, but fundamentally the Torah is written in order. And that means that the goal of leaving Egypt was not receiving the Torah. The Torah is important, necessary, but not the actual goal. The goal is the building of the Mishkan, because the goal is to be an Am Kadosh, a holy people. And holy people create a holy space in which to serve God. That's the Ramban. In fact, the Ramban said more than that. The Ramban says in his commentary on Kedoshim, in chapter 19 of Vayikra, that in fact you can keep the whole Torah and be a bad person. What it calls a Naval B'Shut HaTorah. You can be a bad person. You can, technically speaking, observe everything. But you're a bad person. And if you're doing bad things, how can you do this? And the person will say, where does it say that it's forbidden? Show me where it says it's forbidden. So the Ramban says the many things it doesn't say in the Torah that are forbidden, but good people would never do them. So the goal is not just to get the Torah. The Torah is necessary, but that's not the goal. The goal is to be holy. And being holy, the Ramban thinks, goes way beyond what it, just the mitzvot. Mitzvot are a minimum. But you can keep the mitzvot and not be kadosh, and not be a holy person. And the goal is to be an Am Kadosh. That's the Ramban in the book of Shemot. The Ramban here in Sefer Dvarim makes a similar statement, not in terms of observances necessarily, but in terms of general human behavior. Here the Torah said, "V'yosita hayashar v'yatov b'einei Hashem." For Rashi, that means compromise, going beyond the law. But for the Ramban, v'yosita hayashar v'atov, going beyond the law. One would say going beyond. For the Ramban, going beyond the law is actually part of the law. In other words, the Torah instructs us to go beyond, to go lifnim mishurat hadin. I don't know what the Ramban would say about compromise. That's a separate question. But in terms of lifnim mishurat hadin, v'yosita hayashar v'atov, and other such verses that we find in different parts of our Bible, in Mishlei, to act, to do yashar, mesilat yesharim, those kinds of things. For the Ramban, those are necessary, actually, if one wants to be a good person, a good Jew, a good human being, then one is required to go beyond. That, says the Ramban, is v'yosita hayashar v'hatov. It's very central in the Ramban's thinking, and it's parallel to what the Ramban says back in Vayikra about being holy, about Kedoshim Tiyu. By the way, this idea of the Ramban that he puts forward, the Ramban has many interesting ideas in his commentary on one of the great works that we have, and he has a similar thing in a third place as well, a similar idea, and that is when it comes to the observance of holy days. Let's say the holiest day in the year. The holiest day in the year is of course the Sabbath. The Shabbat is the holiest day in the year. Yom Kippur is in second place. Shabbat is the holiest day. And the Torah says one should observe the Shabbat. The Torah says about the festivals they should be a Shabbaton, a Sabbath observance. And the Ramban on that, also at the end of the book of Vayikra, talks about the idea of Shabbaton. The Ramban says there are different ways to observe Shabbat. The Torah says don't work on Shabbat. Says the Ramban, you could go home, you could sleep half the day, you're not doing any work. You have not violated the Sabbath. Says the Ramban, you haven't violated the Sabbath, that's true. You haven't done work, that's true. But that's not what Shabbaton means. Shabbaton does not mean the absence of work. Shabbaton is a positive, Ramban says. There's a mitzvah to observe the Shabbat in a positive sense. It's not doing work. It's observing the holy days. And the Ramban talks about how one observes the holy days. The Ramban says in the old days, in the Bible, they used to go to the prophet. That's the story of the Shunammite woman who goes off to see Elisha the prophet. And her husband says, why are you going to the prophet? Lo chodesh v'lo Shabbat. It's not Chodesh, it's not Shabbos. You don't go to the prophet. So you see from that word Shabbos, you wouldn't ask the question. I'm going to the prophet because it's Shabbos. Says Ramban that the meals of Shabbat, the reading the Torah on Shabbat, the special prayers of Shabbat, etc., learning on Shabbat, that's the observance of Shabbat. That's the positives of Shabbat. So Shabbat is not something that you don't do. Yes, one doesn't work on Shabbat, of course, but the point is, there's the Shabbaton. There's the positives. I give you 3 examples of something that is very fundamental in the Ramban's thinking and fundamental to his commentary on the Torah. 3 different examples of the similar kind of thinking of the Ramban, the point of the Torah being a book which is guiding us. And I would add something else in terms of the Ramban on Torah. Many years ago, I taught the Ramban on Torah. I gave the sessions on them. And wondering, going back to that, because the Ramban is very important. And it's related, in my view, to something else about the Ramban. The first Ramban on the Torah, the first Rashi on the Torah, is, Rashi asks the question, why does the Torah start with Breshit Bara Elohim? Why is that the beginning of the Torah, says Rashi? The Torah should have begun with Achodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodeshim. Chapter 12 of the book of Exodus, chapter 12 of Sefer Shemot. That's the first mitzvah, says Rashi, that the Jewish people got as a people. That's the Paschal sacrifice. According to Chazal, it's setting up the calendar and the Paschal sacrifice, Kiddush HaChodesh. But those are the first mitzvot that are given to the Jewish people. That's where the Torah should have started. Why is the Torah starting with Bereshit? So Rashi calls him an agadic statement of Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak said, because the world will say this land doesn't belong to you. It's our land. So the Torah starts by saying, no, it's God's land. God parcels it out to whomever God wishes to give it. God gave it to the 7 nations. God threw them out. They were no good. God gave it to the Jews. God could throw us out if we're no good, etc. That's Rashi. That's the first Rashi on the Torah. Why does the Torah start with Genesis? Says the Ramban, I don't understand Rashi. What do you mean, why does the Torah start with Breshit? Of course the Torah starts with Breshit. Torah is not just a book of laws. The Torah is telling you something very basic. God is the creator, and that's something essential. God is the creator. It's God's world. God is king. That affects everything you do. What kind of question is this? Why does the Torah start with Genesis? Now, Rashi didn't ask. Rashi cites the Medrash. Says the Ramban, Rashi misunderstood the Medrash. The Medrash is not asking why the Torah should start with Genesis. Of course it does. The Torah is making a different point, says the Ramban. The Torah could have said, God created heaven and earth. Goodbye. Let's move on. Why all the details? That's the question. Why all the details? And the Ramban adds, being the great mystic that he was, and most of the details we don't understand anyway. So why all the details? Says the Ramban, because there's one very important idea in the creation narrative, the most important idea in the creation narrative. And that is that in the story of the Garden of Eden, when the human being sins, the human is banished from the sacred place. And that, says the Ramban, is the basic idea. That's the basic idea. That it's God's space, and God determines who can remain in that space depending on the behavior of the people. Whether it's the Canaanites, whether it's the Jews, doesn't matter who's there. That's God's space. Elsewhere in the world, okay. But not in this place, not where God is present. That, says the Ramban, is the idea. But what's my point? My point is that for the Ramban, unlike Rashi, for Rashi, the point of the Torah is the commandments. Period, end of report. That's the point. That's the overriding concern of the Bible. Everything else is very secondary. And the Ramban says, no, that's not true. That's not, says many times, the book of Genesis is called Sefer HaYashar, because you learn how to behave not just from a bunch of rules. You see how people act. We learn from our own experience and seeing the experience of others, how righteous people behave. So for the Ramban, the Torah is not just a book of laws. Torah is much bigger than that. So the whole question, why does it start with Breshit, with creation? Because it's not just a book of laws. Rashi says, let us start with the first law. Says the Ramban, no. It's not just laws. It's beliefs, it's faith, it's other kinds of behaviors that are not written down in books. etc., etc. So the Ramban is very, very consistent in this way, the way he sees the Torah in general. It's to teach us many, many different things. One of them are the mitzvot. That's very important, says the Ramban. They're necessary. But you can observe all the mitzvot and be a bum. That's the famous Ramban, Naval B'Shut Torah. Just wanted to make that point. Usually don't get off on these Farshim, but over here, it's such an important Ramban, Yosita Hayashar Vatov. Let me just stop here for a moment if anybody has any comments or questions about this, and then we'll continue with our study. Go ahead.
This might not be the time to ask, but I have a question from last week that I never got to ask.
Go ahead.
And I don't have the text in front of me, but when God says you're going to the land that was not built by you, and you're going, and people thrive not by you, and you discussed all of the things about going to the land in terms of what you can eat and what you can't eat. But what bothered me is you're going to a land that belongs to somebody else, and you're going to take it from them, and it doesn't address the morality or the ethic.
Well, it does address the morality, whether you agree with the morality. It makes it very clear. The Torah is clear about this. The book of, you can raise many questions. It's totally appropriate to raise many questions about some of the values that seem to emerge from the biblical texts, which don't always seem to conform to the way we think about certain things. But the book of Dvarim is very clear about this. It's God's land. Let's start with that. And God determines who stays in God's land. The people living in the land are idolaters, not just that they believe in other gods. Their behavior is abhorrent, and God plans to destroy them and to kick them out and to put you in their place because of promises God made. And that promise is also, as we will see today, we see throughout the book, that's also contingent. I want to make a simple point. The book of Deuteronomy does talk about it. We'll have to deal with this kind of genocidal war. You kill all there's different disagreements among the commentaries, but fundamentally, you kill men, women, and children Canaanites who live in the land. That's explicit. I would just add one little detail to that. That may be the case. But the Torah also says if there's a Jewish city that's worshiping idols, called the Ir Hanidachat, you kill all the men, the women, and the children, and you destroy the city. Take everything in the city and burn it in the middle of the street. So the Torah is very consistent about this, whether we like it or not. The fact of the matter is, this is God's land. That's the first testament I just mentioned just now. It actually is relevant to that medrash. It's God's land. God parcels it out to whomever God wishes to give it. And we have to remember at all times, it's explicit earlier in the Torah that if you don't obey God's commandments, the words of the Chumash, the land will actually spit you out. The land will vomit you out. It's almost as if to say, it's not even as a punishment. It's that you can't be there because the land demands certain kind of behaviors. And if you misbehave, then you can't be there. Oil and water don't mix. You just can't be there. So the Torah is very consistent. It's not about us throwing them out. It's about God throwing them out. That's explicit, and it's stated over and over again. And it's also stated that if you misbehave, I'll throw you out, which is one of the key messages of Sefer Dvarim. It's frightening in that way. There are certain demands because you're standing in God's presence. And you stand in God's presence demands a different kind of behavior. The one who emphasizes more than anybody is actually our teacher, the Ramban. That's the whole point of the Ramban. The Ramban's point is there's a different kind of behavior that's mandated in the land than outside the land. He says this over and over again throughout his commentary, and I'll mention one very interesting place where he says it, without getting to the specifics of the case he's giving, which is this. Ramban is bothered by the following problem. Ramban was bothered by the fact that Jacob is married to two sisters. And the Torah later in the book of Vayikra forbids it. You can't marry if you're married to a woman, you can't marry her sister. You can marry the sister if the first sister dies. But you can't marry two sisters at the same time. Now, Jacob was married to two sisters at the same time, but when Jacob returns to the land, we all know that Rachel dies. So the Ramban, who's a mystic, the Ramban makes the argument, he says, that Rachel dies upon Jacob's return to the land, because in the land, Jacob's not allowed to marry two sisters. This Torah is not given yet, but the prohibition of two sisters, the Ramban claims, only applies inside the land. It doesn't apply outside the land. And the Ramban makes this point in general, that the behavior is required inside the land, and the severity of the crime, says the Ramban, is different inside the land and outside the land, because inside the land you're standing before God. So what's appropriate to do, maybe if you're living some other place, not that it's a good thing to do, not that idolatry is good anywhere, but it's not a kind of affront to God. Here I'm standing before God and I'm worshiping somebody else. So the Ramban is terribly consistent in this. This is the Ramban, more than anybody else. He says this over and over again in different situations, in different contexts. So I just want to make that very clear. It is true that we are coming into the land, and we're going to possess all those things that they did and they built and they made, etc. But God's giving it to you. That's all true. Chumash is explicit. Chumash is also explicit at the end of it, even more so, terrible things that will happen to the Jews if they misbehave. And I mean terrible things. Chapter 28 of Deuteronomy is one of frightening chapter, and 29 is not much better either, about the angry God. That's the book. Our job is to understand the book. And when I just want to make a point about learning Torah as I understand it. Our job is to understand the text. Period. What it says in the text, not to impose on the text to the best of our ability what we would want it to say. Our job is to figure out what it does say. Then there's a second level. Okay, now that it says this, how do I respond to it? Which is completely legitimate. But our job is to try to figure out what it says. And the book of Devarim is about explicit as one can get. But my point is, it's explicit about the Canaanites who live there, and it's equally explicit about those who come in after them, which in this case are the Jewish people, and the kind of response one can expect from God when one misbehaves, which is truly frightening, actually. That's what we'll encounter it in Sefer Devarim. There's a reason that in the book of Kings, when King Yoshiyahu is given this book, which according to most commentaries is Sefer Devarim, and he reads it, he starts to cry. He says, "Uh-oh, this is terrible. What terrible things are going to happen to us?" And it does happen, not in his lifetime, but afterwards. But we'll encounter this over and over again. So it's a very important point that you're making, and we'll see this over and over again in this book. This is what the book is, Sefer Devarim. Does anybody else have any other comments about where? Yes, Tova.
Yeah, but started with creation. And if God created the world, how can we then say that the rest of the Torah is specific to this land, to this people?
Right. So my point is that there are two creation stories. The first creation narrative in chapter 1 is God created heaven and earth. That's chapter 1. Then you have a second creation story in chapter 2 and 3, which is not about the world. It's about one particular place in the world in which God has a special relationship. It's called the Garden of Eden. Now, that Garden of Eden, where God placed God's favorite creation, which is the human being, and that doesn't work out well. That's the story of the Garden of Eden. That's the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And the rest of the book of Breshit is the search for the alternate Eden. That is to say, a place where the human being and God can, in fact, dwell together, be together. That's the search. And there, in the book of Breshit, there are two different possible alternatives to the garden, two good alternatives to the Garden of Eden. One is the land of Canaan, when God says to Abraham, Lech Lecha. And the second is within the land of Canaan, Har Moriah, the place of the temple, the sacred space, which is called the place where God sees and is seen, and where the human can interact. So my answer is there are two different creation narratives. One, God is God of the whole world. There's no question about that. And the human being was created at Tselem Elohim. That's very important. That's chapter 1. And then the Torah claims that there's, within this world, there is also a special place that God occupies. God is very present more than other places, which in the first instance is the Garden of Eden. Later on, it could be Mount Moriah. It could be the place where Jacob goes to sleep and has a dream and he sees a staircase to heaven, etc. So that's really that's very central to the Chumash. And the issue in the book of Breshit, I'm working on a book on Breshit, as you know, but this is a very basic point, and that is that, as I said, the expectation of behavior in the special place is different. You misbehave, that's different. And the point about the alternative to the Garden of Eden is it's an alternative. It's not the Garden of Eden, because the Garden of Eden was given to the human being who doesn't really have knowledge. And after we ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, we have knowledge. And when you have knowledge, you are expected to understand right from wrong, whether you are instructed or not instructed. Let me just say one thing about this question. It's a very important question. I want to take 2 minutes, and it's related. And that is, when it comes to the stories in Genesis, when it comes to Adam and Eve, the Torah is explicit. Adam was told explicitly, do not eat of the fruit of this tree. It's explicit, and Adam violates that command, that prohibition. There's Eve, there's the snake, etc. But that's the only command Adam has. There's only one mitzvah. Lo tochal, don't eat from this particular tree. But afterwards, let's say in the story of Cain and Hevel, when Cain kills Abel, Cain kills Hevel. And at first, they both brought sacrifices to God, and Cain's sacrifice was not accepted, and the sacrifice of Hevel was accepted, and Cain is very angry. And God said to Cain in chapter 4, why are you so angry? Why has your face fallen? What are you angry about? Haloim tetiv se'et. If you do good, se'et, you'll be raised up, you'll be primary, you'll be forgiven, whatever se'et means. If you do good, you'll be fine. What are you worried about? If you don't, sin crouches at the door. And what's interesting is, God didn't say to Cain, if you do A, B, C, D, E. God said something different to Cain, if you do good. And the assumption is that Cain knows good from bad. Why would Cain know good from bad? Because the human being has knowledge. Because the human being has eaten of the tree of knowledge. So we have understanding, we have knowledge, we should know the difference. And therefore, the place that is the alternative to Eden is a place where the human being is going to be held fully accountable for everything that we do, because we have the knowledge. So you can't ever go back to Eden. Eden is a place for people with no knowledge. But now we need a different kind of Eden, a place where we have knowledge and therefore are held accountable for everything that we do. And that's an incredibly important point about our understanding of the Chumash. And it plays out in Sefer Devarim as well. Maybe we'll see that, how it plays out. So, but in short, there are two different creation stories. God is God of all humanity. That is certainly the case. Humans are created in God's image. That's certainly the case, has to be respected. And there's the other point, that not all places are the same. Something fundamental to Judaism, I don't say this too often, fundamental to Judaism is the idea of nuance. The idea that there is holiness and there are different levels of holiness. You know, when the festival falls out on Sunday, when Yom Tov comes on Sunday, we make Havdalah Saturday night. And we make the blessing, Hamavdu ben Kodesh l'Kodesh, who separates the whole, one of my favorite brachas actually, Hamavdu ben Kodesh l'Kodesh, who separates the holy from the holy. We're all familiar with Hamavdu ben Kodesh l'Chol, but there's also Hamavdu ben Kodesh l'Kodesh. The first mission in Tractate Kalim, Esek Kedushot Haim, there are 10 levels of sanctity. And this idea, there are different spaces in this world, the different places that we occupy, the different situations, and there's a lot of nuance. And there are places that are more holy. The Holy of Holies, the high priest goes in once a year. Holiness involves distance as well. There's a recognition that maybe I'm unworthy. So this is a big topic, but I think that is very basic to the to Judaism as classically understood. I think this is something very, very important. And we'll come back. It's a big topic, but the question, thank you for the question. I think that's a really important point. Both of those points are very important. Okay, let's move forward. Anybody else want to speak up? Yeah. So
I have a
so
question.
sometimes, yes.
Oh,
It's Ilana, yeah.
yes,
Ilana,
yeah.
yes. What do you know? Go ahead. Yeah. Nice to see
My
you.
question is about what you were just discussing, the nuances. Are the nuances and the gradations within the holiness determined by God or by human beings or both?
That's a question in general. I would say that certainly God is part of it. You have the rules of the Torah. It's clear in the Torah the different levels of tumah. One of the points that Milgram makes in his massive work on Vayikra, and I say massive, I mean massive, a couple of thousand pages. The opposite of kedusha, that Milgram argues, this holiness. The opposite of kedusha is actually tumah. Tumah and kedusha are opposites, and they're also very similar. As Milgram argues, they're both sort of contagious. It's a longer conversation, but you have in the Torah the different camps. The leper is sent out of 3 camps. The zav is sent out of 2 camps. The tummy base is 1. There's certainly within the different. There's the priesthood. There's all kinds of different levels of sanctity. I think that is certainly in the Chumash, but in our tradition, there's the Torah Sheba'al Peh, Esek Kedusha Hey. So I think it's both. I think that. But I think the way it works, maybe supposed to work, is that we see these values of the Torah, and they should be reflective in everything that we do. I mean, we should be value driven. I think one of the points that I like about the Ramban is, who was in terms of understanding the Torah Sheba'al Peh, I mean, the Ramban is supreme. Nobody like him. He's amazing. But he understands that there are values embedded in these texts, and the point is to go beyond them. That he thinks the values are in the text. But how that plays out in life, that's all contextual. What does it mean to live? It depends on the context. To live the sacred life, to live the holy life, depends on our own. Everybody's in a different place. Everybody has different situations, and to try to think about what is the right thing to do. I think we live in a world where, unfortunately, a lot of our leadership doesn't ask that question. Not what is politically good. What is right. What is the right way to act? I think that's something which is very important. I think our tradition is actually central to the tradition. So I think these different nuances, different gradations, they're in the Chumash. A lot of them are in the Chumash, but I think we're supposed to learn from them and apply them. And each one, we have to try to figure out how to apply that in this world. I would say more generally speaking, I could talk about this forever, but one of the people who actually thought in this way about trying to apply the values of the Chumash to our present day context in terms of Jewish thought, I would say Eliezer Berkowitz. Eliezer Berkowitz is a person. He has several books. I think one is called Not in Heaven, not Lo Bashamayim, not in heaven. His point is that there are certain things in the Chumash that we don't do anymore, but the idea of them still exists. I think one of his examples he gives is actually the sabbatical year, Shemitah. Okay, should it be observed today? Should it not be observed today? How is it observed today? But the idea of Shemitah, the idea that the land is not mine, the idea that I have to feed the poor, that I'm responsible for the poor, etc., etc. His point is there are ways to play that out separate from Shemitah, maybe with a focus on Shemitah. That's one of the examples. So Berkowitz was the one who actually picks up this idea and sort of runs with it. Eliezer Berkowitz. I think it's a very important point. We'll have to leave it at that. There's more to say about this. Thank you for the question. Okay, nice to see you. Okay, so all right, so let's continue now. Fine, let's continue. Now let's get to the next verse, number 20. This is a verse your child will ask you in the future. Macha means in the future, not just the next day. In the future, your child will ask, what are these, here they say, Eidot, I would say testimonies testimonies, laws, and rules that eternal God has enjoined upon you, etchem. Now, this is a verse that many of us are so familiar with because it appears in the Haggadah. In the Haggadah, it's the question that the Haggadah applies to the wise child. Keneged arba banim dibra Torah. In the Haggadah, there's a section which talks about the 4 children, which does appear elsewhere in different form, but the Haggadah has it about 4 children. Echad chacham, echad rasha, echad tipesh. One is the wise, one is the wicked, one is the fool, or the one who doesn't know, not a fool, the one who doesn't know, and the one who doesn't know even how to ask. Those are the 4 children. And the Haggadah assigns a verse of the Bible to each of these 4 children. This is the verse that is assigned to the wise child. The wise child. This is the verse. This verse over here. And the next verse is also in the Haggadah. V'yamarta levincha avodim hoyinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. V'yotzienu Hashem miMitzrayim b'yod chazakah. Avodim hoyinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim is the beginning of the Seder. It's the first. That's how. It's the answer. It's a response to the Madishtana. So these 2 verses are front and center in the Passover Haggadah. Now, what's very interesting is I have just a couple of thoughts about this, and that is that what's interesting is if we continue to read in the Chumash, the response you should say to your child, "Avodim hayinu," and then it continues. Let's find the verse. The next verse is. Vayitein Hashem ototu moftim gedolim v'ra'im b'Mitzrayim b'Faro v'chol beito v'yinenu v'yotanu hotzi misham l'man v'yotanu v'ted lanu et haaretz shenishbar avotenu. This is the response. And notice something else, the response over here that God did all these marvelous miracles, etc. V'yotanu hotzi, and God took us out of there, took us from there to bring us into the land. The verse v'yotanu hotzi misham, that verse is also in the Haggadah, in a different place. In the past, if you remember the Haggadah, and you remember, towards the end of Magid, we had the statement, in every generation, we have to see ourselves as leaving Egypt. Not only our ancestors and God saved, we were saved as well. As it is written, God took us out of there. To bring us into the land. Then we pick up the cup of wine and say, therefore we have to say Hallel. Therefore we have to give thanks to the God who took us out. And we will sing V'nomer lefanav Shira Chadasha. So these verses are central to the Haggadah, absolutely central to the Haggadah. What's interesting is that in this at the Seder, the question, the child, the so-called wise child asked the question, what are the testimonies and the rules and the regulations and the laws that God gave us? What is in the Chumash? The answer is God took us out of Egypt. God gave us all these rules, and it continues to say the next verse is God commanded us to do these rules in verse number 24, in order that we fear God and do what is and do the right thing, and it will be good for us. Utzedakah, it will be accounted in our merit if we fulfill these commandments. Because by fulfilling the commandments, we can stay inside the land. That's what it says in the Torah. What does it say in the Passover Haggadah? Who remembers what the answer is to the wise child in the Passover Haggadah? Exactly. You ever wonder about that? The Haggadah cites a verse from the Torah. Someday your child's going to ask you, and the Torah tells you what to say. You shall say v'yabarta elov. Say the following thing: we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. God redeemed us. God gave us the laws, the commandments, and if we keep these laws and commandments, it will be good for us. We'll possess a land. That's completely absent in the Passover Haggadah. Instead, the Haggadah makes up its own answer. After Emerald, teach them the laws of the Passover. One may not eat after eating the afikomen. One may not eat. In maftirin achar Pesach afikomen. The afikomen is the last thing that one eats at the Seder. So let's simply point out that is very strange. Why would you give a separate answer? The Chumash gives an answer. And what is the answer anyway? In Maftir Nachar HaPesach. Now, we're not here studying the Haggadah, which is a worthwhile thing to do, but that's not our topic. But I want to make just one observation about the Haggadah. And that is that one of the claims that the Haggadah is making, very important claim, is somebody comes, they want to understand Judaism. You want to understand Judaism? Let me tell you, if you want to understand Judaism, here's what you should do. Observe the Seder. Observe the Seder the way the classical Seder. Nowadays, people have all kinds of Sedarim. But the point is, observe the Seder. If you want to understand Judaism, you observe the Seder. Because what the Seder is about, actually, the classical Seder, is about people coming together, different kinds of people coming together. There are 4 different kinds of children. There are old people, there are young people, there's all kinds of different people coming together to basically study. That's what the Haggadah is, to learn, to explore our tradition. And it's connected with, it's not just an even of learning, there's a deep connection between what we eat, actually, which is a sacrificial meal, optimally, but the Passover meal, and what we study and what we think. There's a relationship between the learning and the doing. And they're actually interwoven at the Seder. Up until the very end of the meal, which is the Afikomen. Teach this child everything up to and including the Afikomen. You understand the saying. You want to know about Judaism? You want to know about the testimonies and the rules and the laws? Let me give you experience it, because we go into our experiences. If you experience what the Seder should be, coming together to ask questions, to reflect upon it, to exchange ideas, to disagree with each other. That's what the Seder is, optimally. And it's combined with the meal. It's interwoven into the meal. You start with Kiddush, that's the meal. Then you stop and you tell the story. Then you eat the meal. Then you have the songs, the praises, the Hallel, etc. They're all interwoven with each other. You want to know Judaism? Study the core Jewish ritual, which is the Seder. And I want to say something else about this before I take any comments or questions. And what is very interesting, we're studying the book of Devarim. What is very striking is the degree to which this book is the core book of Jewish practice. The core rituals of the Jewish people are coming out, as understood rabbinically at least, out of Sefer Devarim. There's the Shema, the first parsha of the Shema. There's the second parsha of the Shema. That's the core piece of liturgy of the Jewish people. There is the text about the Haggadah, Seder, which is the core ritual of the Jewish people. And just a couple of chapters later, there is the following verse, which is familiar to us. You come into the land, and this land is a good land, the Torah is going to say later. There's all kinds of things grow in the land. Eretz Chita, Usara, Gefen, Tenav, Rimon, Eretz Sheben, Dvash. There are these 7 different species, 7 things that grow in the land, the wheat, etc. Chitos, Ora, Gefen, right? And it says you're going to, right? And you will partake of these things. V'yachalta v'sovata, you will eat and be satiated. Uveirachtu at Hashem Elohecha al aretz hatovar shenat harloch, and you will bless God for the good land that God has given you, which is chapter 8, verses number 9 and verse 10, actually. Chapter 8, verse 10. Now, when you read chapter 8, verse 10, V'yachalta v'sovata uveirachtu at Hashem Elohecha al aretz hatovar shenat harloch, there's that verse right there. When you read it, it's very far from clear that the Torah is actually mandating that you bless God. What it sounds more like, actually, is, the Ramban has noticed this as well, that you can read the verse very differently. You'll come into the land, you'll have all this great food, and you will bless God. You say, wow, this stuff is so good. Wow. In other words, the rabbinic understanding is not that way. It's not that you will say, wow, this is great. It's that you will eat and be filled up with savata, and then you are commanded. Uveirachta as a command. And the Ramban points out that many places where you have this kind of language, but it's understood and it's clear that it's actually a command. This is the command of what's called Birkat HaMazon, to bless after to bless, to thank God after we have eaten a meal. And actually, according to most authorities, the only blessing that the Jewish people have that's mandated from the Torah is the blessing we make after we have a meal. All the other blessings are rabbinic in nature. They're not coming from the Torah. The rabbis made them up. Blessing before we eat other foods, blessing after foods, blessing when you see certain things, blessing on mitzvot, all of these blessings. With one possible exception, they're all rabbinic. The main blessing is Birkat HaMazon, blessing after we eat. It's demonstrating gratitude for what we have. This is coming out of the book of Devarim. So you're talking about the core liturgy that we have. Not to mention, of course, later on, we have the prayer of the pilgrim who brings the first fruits to the temple, which of course is the main text of the Passover Haggadah, Arami Oved Avi. So something to think about, actually. Maybe we'll talk about this in the future. Why is it that the rabbis chose the book of Devarim to be the book which is the basis for our fundamental blessings, whether it's and rituals, whether it's the Shema, whether it's Birkat HaMazon, or whether it's the Seder. Those are the core rituals of the Jewish people. And they're all emerging in one form or another from the book of Devarim. And by the way, it's also not clear when you read the Shema that there's a mitzvah to recite the Shema. That's the rabbinic understanding of what the Torah says. But that is the understanding of what the Torah says. It's the very first Mishnah in our code. That's how we start our study of the Mishnah. Anyway, just wanted to make that point. Let me make one point here about these. I call them Moshe's sermons, what they really are. Moshe's sermons. And I want just to pick out a couple of things I think are very important about these various sermons. One of the issues that is, remember, the book of Devarim says, this is what Moshe is saying to the people in the 40th year of the desert. The 11th month of the 40th year, the end of the journey. It's prior to possessing the land. And Moshe is giving his teachings prior to possessing the land. He's telling them what to anticipate when you come into the land. That's what this book is about. It's about what to anticipate. It's about giving a whole new set of commandments that will be relevant when you enter the land. You already talked about that a bit. And there's a warning, a big warning. And we'll get to that next week when he retells the story of the golden calf, which is very interesting. Tells a different story, but it's book of Devarim. None of the stories in Sefer Devarim are exactly the same as the stories when we first read them earlier in the Torah. And the book of the golden calf story is in particular interesting, and it is really the focus of Moshe. The main story that Moshe tells is the story of the golden calf. I just wanted to say one other thing about what Moshe is teaching over here in Sefer Devarim. Moshe seems to have one main concern. It appears over and over again in this book, certainly in these sermons that he's given, and his concern can be summed up in either one word or in two words. I would say one is lo tishkach, do not forget, and the other is the word zachor, remember. Over and over again, we are being commanded here not to forget and to remember. And specifically, what should we remember? So we're told here that we have to remember the fact that we were slaves in Egypt. That's number one. That God redeemed us from Egypt. That's critical to remember that. But then we're also told something else to remember, and that is verses that we saw last week. We are told that to remember, this is the beginning of chapter 8. We saw this last week. And I'll read again the verse, chapter 8, verse number 2. V'zacharta kol haderech asher holichacha Hashem Elohecha hazeh 40 shana bamidbar. We are to remember the journey. Now, not just that you were slaves and were freed, But you should remember the 40-year journey. Remember, Moshe is speaking at the end of the 40 years. You should remember the journey of 40 years and the lessons that you learned from the journey. And the lessons are quite remarkable, actually. That why did God keep you in the desert for 40 years? L'man anotcha l'nasotcha, l'dat et asher bilvavcha hatishmar mitzvotav imlo. It's presented here as a test. It's a test. That's a nisayon l'nasotcha, and to know whether what is in your heart or not. That's the question. Does God not know? Does the God of the Bible not know? Well, God knows, but it's more that we have to understand. That's a good question. It's presented elsewhere. The word Nisayon first appears in the story of the binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak, Elohim Nisa et Avraham. At the end of the Nisayon, the angel calls down from heaven, Ato Yodati Ki Yireh Elohim. I now know that you are a God-fearing person. That certainly suggests that God did not know prior to that. People have free will. Okay, that's an interesting question. But the idea of the test or the trial is very striking. We have to remember the lessons to be learned from the journey. And as I mentioned last week, the next verse in particular is striking. There are two verses that are striking. This one, Vayancha vayarivecha. Vayancha, to be subjected. Inui is abuse or suffering, often sexual, but not only. Here it's not sexual, but here's something very basic, which is food. If you don't have food, you're hungry, you can't eat, no food. That's something that affects you in the most personal sense. It affects the very being. As a sexual violation affects the very being of the person. Vayancha vayarivecha. And God caused you to be hungry. A rav is a famine. And God gave you the manna, which you did not know. Nor did your ancestors know it. And the question is that part of Vayancha Vayarivecha? Why the emphasis on the food you did not know, nor did your ancestors know it? The very word man, actually, one of the explanations of the word man, it's like the word ma, what? The Torah said in the book of Shemot, they called it man. Ki lo yadu mahu. They didn't know what it was. The idea of the unfamiliar, which can be very unsettling to us. We like things that are familiar to us. Things that are unfamiliar to us, we question, we're concerned about them, etc. So one way to understand the man, God brought you to a desert where there's no food. And on top of that, yes, God did give you the man, but the solution to the problem was not an easy solution. You didn't know what it was. It was the unknown. And we all remember that back in the Torah, the people complained about the man. Back in the book of Bamidbar, the people said to Moshe, we're sick of this man. We prefer to be in Egypt. Slaves in Egypt. We had watermelons and cucumbers and garlic, etc., and fish. There we had real food. What is this business with the man? So this perhaps is part of the education, part of the trial, part of the testing. And here the lesson. The human being lives not on bread alone. But we live by paying attention to what God is saying. One might say, not what goes into your mouth, but what comes out of God's mouth. That's what it says here in chapter 8. And later, actually, towards the end of the chapter, there's even something more striking than that. Again, the man is mentioned again, as I mentioned last week, in verse 16 of chapter 8, and we saw this last week as well. God gave you the man, right? In the previous verse, it mentions God brought you through the desert. Verse number 15, right? God brought you to an awesome desert. Nachash saraf v'yakra v'tzimaon asher ein mayim. It's serafim, serpents and scorpions, a parched land with no water. Right? That's where you were. Who gave you water out of the rock from the flinty stones. There was no obvious water there. You're in a place where you are fully dependent on God. Again, fed you with the man that you did not know, your ancestors didn't recognize it. L'man anotecha, to subject you to hardships. U'leman nasotecha, and to test you. And here we have the key words. Heitivcha b'achritecha, to benefit you in the end. In other words, what Moshe is saying over here is a remarkable set of verses, actually. God is our teacher. God is our Rebbe. And the idea is being a generation subjected to hardships, because at the end of the day, that's how you learn. That's how you learn. You learn through your experience. It wasn't just, another point that the Ramban elsewhere emphasizes, it's not just the mitzvot, but rather the experiences of life. Life can teach you, if you're open to it, life can teach you many things. I've taught at Risha now for many years, and different classes, and many of the people that I've taught over the years, the women, were not given the opportunity, actually, to have a real full Jewish education. But they had a different understanding, which is life experience. And I have a lot of respect for that. Life teaches us, if we can pay attention, life can teach us many things. And the point over here is that the learning that we, over the 40 years, was not just learning from hearing what God says, but rather from the experience, from managing through the desert with all the hardships. And the Mon teaches us many things. One of the chief things it teaches us is to figure out what we actually need to live. Not what we want, or we believe we want, but what we need. And the Mon gives you enough food to live on. Not less. You have exactly what you need. It doesn't give you more than you need. If you try to keep it, it spoils. But it gives you what you need. So the point is that over here, it describes God as a teacher. Now, related to this is the following set of verses. And this is what I wanted to emphasize today, which is just a few verses before that. Once again, we have this theme of forgetting. This is chapter 8, verse number 14. Here, it says, Hisham Elocha pen tishkach et Hashem Elohecha. Be careful not to forget. The previous verse was about being satiated and blessing God for the good that you have. And then the next verse is, Hisham Elocha pen tishkach et Hashem Elohecha. Be careful not to forget. Verse number 12, pen tochal v'savata, uvatim tovim tivneh v'yashavta, ubekarcha b'tzancha yirbiyun, b'kesef v'zahav yirbelach, chol shelecha yirbe v'ram levavecha v'shachachta et Hashem Elohecha. So there's a concern over here that when they bring you to the land where there's less hardship, where you eat and are satiated, v'savata, you're satiated, and you have more things. You're going to build things, and you'll have much. The word tirbeh will multiply. Your flocks will multiply. Your money will multiply. Your gold will multiply. All that you have will multiply, and you will become haughty, and you will forget. So there's a danger. Moshe is concerned about this, that you will forget. In the desert, you're not going to forget so easily because you depend upon God for next morning's breakfast, because you have nothing else. So you're not going to forget. You recognize your limitations. When you come into the land, you might not recognize the limitations. So that's one concern. That's a concern, pen tishkach, in chapter 8. However, there is another concern. Later on in the Torah, there's a different concern. I can't find this verse now, but I have to tell you what it is. There were two verses, two concerns that Moshe has about when they're leaving the desert. One concern is that, and this is in chapter 9 actually, one concern is, and we'll get to this next week, chapter 9, verse 4. Al tomar bilvavcha, do not think. When God chases the other nations out before you, don't think. Because of my merit, because of my righteousness, God has enabled me to possess this land. I'm so good. That's the reason I possess the land. And Moshe says, Lo b'tzidkatcha, verse number 5. Uviyoshe levavcha tabala reshet et artzam, ki b'rishat hagoyim ha'ela, Hashem Elohecha morisha mipanecha, u'leman hakim et ha'davar shenishba Hashem la'avotecha, li'Avraham, li'Yitzchak, li'Yaakov. It's not because you're so good, says Moshe. It's not because you're righteous, you possess the land. No. It's the wickedness of the people that are there. I have to kick them out because they're wicked. And on top of that, I made promises. And I'm a God who keeps my promises. So one concern is, Moshe's concern for the future is people will think how wonderful they are. Look at this, I have this land because God is rewarding me for my righteousness. Says Moshe in chapter 9, you're not so righteous. And we'll get to that next week. And as an example of that, the golden calf. So that's one concern. But there's actually another concern. I can't find this verse, but it's here, and I will tell you what the concern is. The concern is that people who are successful will think that they were successful because of their own actions. That all of this possessions, all of this achievement. And this is the main concern, I think, of Sefer Devarim. I have to find this verse. As soon as the class is over, I'm sure I'll find it. But the concern is that people will say, Kolchi v'otzem yodi oso li et hachayo hazeh. That all of the possessions, all of the success, the possession of a land, is a function of me. Kolchi v'otzem yodi, my strength, my power, enabled me to possess all of this. And Moshe says it's not because of you. It's not because of your power. No. This is part of God's plan. It has nothing to do with you. Not because of you. That I would say, Kochi v'yotzem yodi, is the primary worry of Sefer Devarim. I just wanted to reflect upon this for a moment, and we'll pick this up next week. This is to me, the most important. I found it. It's the end of chapter 8. It's like the next verse, actually. You will say in your heart, chapter 8, verse 17. After you, right? You say, God has given you the hardships and trained you that it's good at the end for you. It's going to be good at the end. Next verse. And you will say, when the good arrives, when you're possessing the land, your beautiful land, you possess it, you might say, you will say to yourselves in your hearts, it's all about me. It's my strength, my power. And Moshe says, then remember God. Remember, I said that remembering and not forgetting are the key over here. You remember your God, who anotenu koach lasot chayo. L'mano kimet brito asher nishbar lavotecha. No, it's not your strength. God has empowered you to fulfill God's promises. It's not about you. It's about God keeping God's word. The concern is kochi v'yotzem yodi. To me, that's always a concern. About our own strength. We're so strong, we're so powerful, that kind of thing. And that's what Sefer Devarim is concerned about. I just want to make one last comment about this. Kochi v'yotzem yodi. There's always a danger. But what's interesting is, let me just conclude with the following observation. And that is, the story of the Torah is about two generations. They're the generation that was slaves in Egypt, and they left the land of Egypt. We were freed, traveled through a desert, and after about a year, we were poised to possess a land, promised land. But the people could not possess the land. They felt they can't do it. There are giants in the land, and we are incapable of possessing this land. We'd rather go back to Egypt, they say. Nitna rosh v'noshuva mitzrayim. That's generation number one. Generation number two were never in Egypt. They were never slaves. They never want to go back to Egypt. Why would they? They were never there. They have a different problem in the Chumash, which is, why are we meandering around in the desert? Let's just go straight into the land. That's their complaint. And when you have two sides of the coin over here, generation number one always carry with them the slave mentality. And we who left Egypt were never fully free. We were free from the bondage of Egypt, but mentally, in a sense, we're still slaves. Always depending on someone else, depending on someone else to save us, depending on God to do all the work without doing the work ourselves. That's the problem of generation number one. Generation number two, in the book of Bamidbar, and especially in Sefer Devarim, has got a different problem. Their problem is not depending on somebody else to do everything for them. Their problem is thinking they could do it themselves without God's assistance and without recognizing how they got to where they are. That's part of Kochi V'yotzim Yadi. Kochi V'yotzim Yadi forgets the past, forgets the struggles, forgets other people's struggles that enabled us to be where we are, which is even worse, forgetting our own struggles, but forgetting the work that was done by others to enable us to be in a better place. That's the concern of the Torah's concern of the second generation, and that's the concern of Sefer Devarim in particular. The idea of forgetting, not to remember, the idea that become so satiated just living in the moment and forget everything else, and even worse, thinking that we ourselves are the architects of all that has transpired for good. That's the Kochi V'yotzim Yadi. That's such a religious danger. And that's the primary concern of Moshe and Sefer Devarim. We'll pick up with this next time. But next week, I'd like to focus on the story of the golden calf. Now, again, we're not going through every verse over here. I'm trying to get, at least in my view, what are the core issues of the book. We're looking at some of the verses and Moshe's sermons. I think there's always more, but I think I've been able to identify some of the core issues in the book. Okay, if anybody has any questions, you can always email me. Yes, Aviva, you want to say something? Go ahead.
A quick one. In the verses you read, the word inui in one conjugation or another is mentioned 3 times at least.
Yes.
The covenant included inui.
Yes,
Is
it did.
this part of the covenant? It's not the same inui as slavery, but is this part of that?
I think it is. I think that's Gerud. The conditions for the covenantal conditions were Gerud, Avdut, and Inui.
Yes.
And yes, there was Inui in Egypt. That's how the book of Exodus begins. Kasher Yanu Oto Ken Yebevechen Yefrots. There's Avdut, of course, in Egypt. And Gerut. Moshe named his son Gershom. Ger Yiti B'Eretz Nachriyah. But the word Inui is a critical word. The trick is to learn from our own experience. I think Inui is, the Torah makes a point that many people don't want to hear. How do we learn things in life? Some people learn from their successes. Those are few and far between. To the extent we learn anything, usually it's from the bad consequences of what happened, the mistakes that we make. And the trick in life is not to make the same mistake again, which sounds a lot easier than it actually is. So as we're sort of programmed a certain way, we see things a certain way, keep making those same mistakes over and over again. But but what Moshe is saying over here is to learn from the Inui. The idea of Inui was, we think of Moshe as Moshe Rabbeinu, but in the book of Devarim is God who is Rabbeinu, actually. Moshe is saying, this is what God was trying to teach you for these 40 years. That's why you had 40 years in the desert, to learn how to live in a way that connects you to that which is Yashar and Tov, in the words of the Torah. But I do think the word Inui is, these words are not 3 times yes, and it's a critical word, Inui, of course. In fact, when God decides to take the Jews out of Egypt, Vayaret Anyam, right?
Mhm.
Vayaret Ra'ol ra'iti et oni ami, the first thing God says to Moshe at the burning bush. Ra'ol ra'iti et oni ami asher b'Mitzrayim. I've seen the Inui.
But it's
Inui is something
interesting.
in the Bible you usually see. Almost always, with one exception, you see the Inui. God sees, takes the verb to see. God sees the Inui. I'll stop at this point. You can always email me at dsilber@risha.org. Look forward to next week. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And I'd like to highlight some upcoming classes. If you've enjoyed learning with Rabbi Silber, he is going to be starting a new class, Mishnah In-Depth Kritot. This is an asynchronous class in our Mishnah In-Depth series with videos weekly. You can sign up at drisha.org/classes starting next Sunday. This week, Queen of Modern Politics, How Esther Inspired America and Europe with Rabbi Stu Halpern will begin this Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern. And Rabbi Morrow's class, Medieval Solutions for Modern Problems, continues this week, Tuesday at 12:30 Eastern. And we really hope to see you for any and all of these classes. Take care, and I look forward to learning with you next week.